But when you do focus groups and you introduce people to the idea of climate intervention, what has been noted in now multiple studies is people say, oh my God, we're thinking about that. This all must be more serious than I realized. And
Hmm.
people's interest and like attention on decarbonization goes up rather than going down.
Okay, hello. We are on. Welcome to the Inevitable and Obvious podcast, Dakota.
Thank you so much. It's fun to be here.
You were the first person I thought of when I wanted to launch this show. You were the first person I wanted to have a conversation with, and so we'll do your intro in a second. But I guess if you're listening to this show or if you're watching this, this is a new podcast where I'm trying to bring what's happening in the climate interventions field kind of more out into the open, so that we can have more discussions about it. So, Dakota, you are the CEO, founder of Reflective. And I thought it would be really good to just start with, what is Reflective? Who are you? Why are you doing this? And then we'll go from there.
Cool. Awesome. So Reflective is an independent, philanthropically funded nonprofit organization. And our goal is really to radically accelerate research into sunlight reflection and specifically stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. And I think that my path into all of this is maybe actually an interesting sort of, it helps to explain, I think why lots of us are paying attention to this topic, and, maybe a bit of the ethos behind the organization. So I spent most of my career in global health and global development. I worked as a consultant to the Gates Foundation and then worked for the CEO at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, both doing vaccine-related stuff. And then in 2016 through 2022, I was working on digital ID and digital privacy. So all of my career has been sort of these big topics of like, how do people thrive? And I think it was probably about 2018, was doing a lot of work with UNHCR, with the UN's refugee agency, on digital identity. And that was a pretty sobering experience because I started to realize just how overstretched the international system already is with the number of people who are displaced. And at the same time, we were doing a lot of work with the government of Bangladesh on digital credentials that could work across international borders and across institutional borders. And the Bangladeshis were pretty rare among governments in saying that that was a critical user requirement. Most governments, they care about providing services to their own citizens within their own country. And so when we pushed them on why, behind closed doors, they would say something to the effect of like, look, we expect potentially hundreds of millions of Bangladeshis to be displaced, some internally, but many outside the country in the coming century, due to warming. And I just couldn't square the two, right? It was, I was going between these two rooms, and one was hundreds of millions of people displaced, and the other was, our systems are at a breaking point already.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really started waking up with this sense of, if I'm not working on climate, like, what am I doing with my time? It is going to be the determinant of sort of progress on everything and on anything, whether that's kids having healthcare or, people being able to access vital services. And when I shifted into climate, what really struck me was timelines. Like, we have to do everything we can to decarbonize. We have to adapt. We have to scale up carbon removal. But sort of even with maximum effort, we've locked in an amount of warming that's going to matter for all of these people and for ecosystems. And so it kind of kept bringing back to this question of like, what options might be relevant on near-term timescales to prevent some of the worst harms. SAI kept coming up as one of the few potential interventions that could matter on those timescales. And then as I started digging into that, the sort of next thing started to realize was, we just weren't on a trajectory to have the data or the tools that we would need to evaluate SAI fast enough sort of to matter. We don't know enough about the safety or the efficacy or the second order impacts to make really good choices. And so Reflective really exists to solve that problem. And so our mission statement is, it's equip the world with the data and tools needed to make informed decisions about SAI fast enough to matter. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
fast enough to matter is like really the critical clause. So we're agnostic about what what all of this data ultimately leads to. If science says that deploying SAI is a bad idea, that clarity would be a really, really good outcome. But the thing we're really worried about is decisions being made in the dark.
Right. Right. You and I have had conversations about this before where it has seemed like that there's a lot of talk about the need for, in terms of sunlight reflection, like this is a global problem. This would be a global, if we're talking about stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, like that's a global implementation, like it affects everyone. And so, anyone who has been paying attention to this space knows that like we don't even know how we make a decision. Like what even is that? But it does seem clear to me that there is this like strategic sort of thing, which is what you're describing here. And I think it makes a lot of sense that like we need to know what are the things that if we were making a decision, like I sort of imagine like if we had a hypothetical room with the decision makers inside of it, like if they're going to be smart about this, if it's like the way that it might be depicted in a movie, they would have specific questions about trade-offs, about implementation costs, about maintainability over time, about the risks, and all of these various types of things. And you're right, like we don't really have good answers for some or many of those questions. And so you guys are kind of in that space, right?
I mean, I would say that we don't have good answers for all those questions. And we also don't really have a shared map at the moment of what those questions even are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is, part of, I think, what makes this topic very interesting to some and very frightening to others is it is complicated at almost every possible level. It's complicated in terms of who is involved, who is participating in what conversations, what decisions. It's complicated in terms of the decisions themselves and the trade-offs inherent in them. But I don't think it's exceptional in being a really complicated problem. Like there are other fields, whether it's AI safety or various biomedical interventions or whatnot, that have posed really similar and similarly complex questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the challenge becomes like, how do we sort of as rigorously as possible start to unpack all that complexity and sort of decompose it in a way that allows the sort of collective research community, the governance community, et cetera, to hone in on the things that really matter. And so that's really what we've started or sort of are trying to do with this uncertainty database that we've released recently. The intent behind it was, how do we start to move towards some shared map?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we jump into the uncertainty database, something you just said is a question I've been sort of pondering a lot too, which is, you talk about the complexity level around AI. And it seems to me like as a society and as sort of, people who are involved in implementations of these things, it feels like we have been taking very different approaches towards large scale climate change solutions as opposed to the growth of the AI industry. Like, what do you think about that? And like, what's your opinion of that?
I think you're right. I think that, it is interesting to see, sort of such an accelerationist
Uh-huh.
general attitude around AI. There's plenty of people who are very much not accelerationist and are trying, desperately to kind of wind things back. But on net, I think things are only accelerating in the
Yeah.
AI space, and certainly climate intervention has been notably sort of measured in even just discussing it. I
Right.
think there's a few things behind that. I mean, one is certainly there are enormous fortunes to be made in AI and everything surrounding it, and so there's a
Mhm.
lot of people deeply incentivized, to kind of you know accelerate as much as possible. Um, I also think that it seemed more innocuous, perhaps, at kind of the earlier stages, which has then led to some quality of inevitability
You're talking about on the
on
AI
the AI
side?
side. Yeah,
Yeah, like a Chat GPT-3 writing a haiku in the
right.
style of Dr. Seuss. That's not
How
scary.
charming, right? You're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I get to send my, like, grandma a Dr. Seuss haiku for her birthday." And, it's a fun giggle.
Hmm.
And there were definitely plenty of people who were thinking both about the potential power of it and the potential concerns of it, even at that point. But I think for the average person, that first introduction was a Dr. Seuss style haiku.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and so I think by the time then many people started getting more concerned, um, things were a bit more unbounded.
Yeah, and then in the intervention space, there's a lot of resistance to this. There's a lot of belief that we shouldn't even be researching it, which, as where reflective sits, I sort of imagine like a lot of people don't think that you should be doing the work that you're doing. How do you respond to those sorts of critics?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of different arguments that people give for why we shouldn't be doing this research. And,
Mm,
um, one of the ones that we hear a lot is concerns um, around moral hazard. And look, like moral hazard is a thing I take seriously. Um, and concerns around moral hazard have been raised with adaptation, they've been raised with CDR. Like, it has been a sort of recurrent theme with each of these sort of new fields of the climate response. So partially it's a bit of, uh, you know, I don't know. It feels a little slippery when it's being kind of applied in lots of different ways.
mm,
I think the other thing, um, there is at the moment no real. It's impossible to know, right? Like you can't really run a counterfactual with, like,
yeah,
are we actually seeing evidence of moral hazard as people learn about this topic, or they learn about CDR, they learn about
and
anything
it,
that's not decarbonization. But
yeah,
when you run focus groups, um, that's not what the data shows. So very small, realize it's a sort of rough proxy for societally, is this a real concern or not? But when you do focus groups and you introduce people to um, the idea of climate intervention, what has been noted in now multiple studies is people say, "Oh my God, we're thinking about that. This all must be more serious than I realized." And
hmm
people's interest and like attention on decarbonization goes up rather than going down. So I'm not sure the evidence bears out. And then I think the third piece is, um, you know, I, I care about decarbonizing deeply. But I mostly think about decarbonization as a means to an end. And that end is a sort of, a planet that is healthy and, where people can thrive and ecosystems are protected. And, I think the risk is at times we may forget what we are, why we are in this fight.
yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
so
As do you mean like as people get caught up in like these internecine like academic debates,
yeah, or just,
or something different?
if you're saying like, it's all about, yeah, if the concern is, uh, there's this moral hazard associated with thinking about intervention, and we basically need to stick to some line of like it is the only tool is
Hmm.
around decarbonization.
Hmm.
Um, that we are at a place where like the harms from climate are mounting. People's lives are being very, they're being negatively impacted in very real ways.
Mm-hmm.
And um, uh, that is true whether or not, uh, it is, I want to make sure that we provide sort of people as many opportunities to thrive. And sometimes that means thinking in a portfolio of approaches rather than just having sort of a single approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, of course. One of the so I think your first product that Reflective put out was the simulator tool, which is sort of for like scenario planning. What and then the next tool that we're going to talk about is the uncertainty database, which is new. So how do these tools, like, who are you trying to enable here? Who are you making these for?
Yeah. They're tools meant for very different kind of communities. We built the simulator really to address, sort of the challenge of, there's been decades of modeling work done on SAI.
Mm-hmm.
And while there are lots of things that we don't know, and we don't know as well as we will need to be able to make well-informed decisions. There's also been considerable work done that, allows us to make some claims about, like, if SAI is deployed and if it's deployed in this particular way, what that might lead to. And so one of the things we were observing was, um, oftentimes we would hear these sentences that were literally like, SAI will do X. And the thing is, like, SAI is not a monolithic intervention. There's a whole set of choices about how one might deploy, what altitude, what latitude, seasonally, consistently, et cetera, that have huge implications for the impacts of SAI.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really wanted to, like, help people understand that there's not just a single choice of, like, do you deploy? Yes, no. But there's lots of, sort of subtlety and nuance to, if you deploy in different ways, what does that mean? So if you
Right.
want to, I mean, you can kind of mess around with this here and I can try and kind of
Yeah.
narrate what
So,
we're showing.
and if you're listening to this, we've pulled up the simulator on the video. Yeah. So guide me through it.
Yeah. So, okay, here on the left, what you're seeing is a map, obviously, and there's this line here with a little slider, and you can slide that back and forth. And what we were trying to illustrate with this is sort of the risk framework that people talk about. There are risks of deploying SAI. There are also risks of not deploying SAI, and I think that's often a very hard thing to hold and to think about. It's easy to try and compare what might the risks of something be relative to the world we live in today. It's very hard to say, what would the risks of something be relative to, a world 50, 100 years from now,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't live in and I don't experience. And so what this slider allows you to do, if you're here on the left-hand side, is showing what the world would look like. And I guess this is at the end of the century, without any SAI. So this is no intervention. Things are really hot. In particular, you see lots of amplified warming at the North and South
Just
poles.
deep, dark red colors,
Yeah.
much warmer than they should be.
Yeah. If you slide this back over, then you'd see in this particular SAI deployment scenario what things would look like with some intervention. So in this case, we've set a cooling target of holding temperatures at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So that's basically saying we are going to use SAI to meet our Paris Agreement targets.
Mm-hmm.
And I should note that all of this is being done. You can change all of these things, but the baseline warming scenario that we're looking at here is one of sort of moderate emissions reduction. It's sort of the business as usual course that I think scientists think we are closest to being on at the moment. So what you see in, if you go back to the map, is, in this scenario where you've done cooling and you've held temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius, things are broadly a lot cooler than they are, than if you have the slider sort of shifted back over. You still have
Mm-hmm.
amplified warming in both the North and South poles, but you have some areas, particularly up in the North Atlantic, that are cooler. And then if you want to, you can go click under, see where it says temperature up here?
Yeah.
Right? You can select, maybe water availability. And this allows you to see how precipitation would change. And I think this is where you start to see some of the things that people rightfully are more worried about. How would SAI change precipitation patterns? I don't know if it makes sense for us to do this live right now, but one of the things that's really striking is, that the scenario that you're looking at the moment assumes hemispherically balanced SAI. So you're putting roughly the same amount of material in both the northern and southern hemispheres.
Mhm.
And the way that this has been designed is to try and cool as evenly as possible. One of the things that I think the modeling work that's been done to date has yielded is that hemispherically balanced cooling seems to be sort of generally beneficial. You put roughly the same amount of material into both hemispheres cool at about the same amounts, and with that, you don't see any major shifts in precipitation patterns. If you were to put lots of material into only one hemisphere, what you'd see is a real shift in precipitation in ways that could be really, really deleterious. And so, one of the things that I'd encourage people, if you're sitting at home and want to play around with this, if you see up in sort of in that scenario builder box at the top, there's a use custom injection little toggle.
Mhm.
And this is where things get really interesting. If you do that and then you click into this custom scheme and you go to Northern Hemisphere, for example, save and run, you will see some of those really, really drastic
Oh
precipitation
yeah.
changes. That's not good.
Yes.
um, so,
That
uh,
impacts agriculture. That means famine, drought,
yeah,
war potentially to follow on.
yeah. And so that I think is really kind of the key point that I mentioned at the top of all this is uh, there are risks associated with doing SAI at all. But there are many risks that I think are scenario dependent. They are functions of how somebody would choose to deploy, maybe more so than their functions of just the fact that you're deploying at all.
Mhm.
And so the idea behind this tool is, a, to just kind of take the science that that has been done to date by decades of researchers, um, and try and put it into a format that allows people to kind of visualize all of this a lot better. I want to be really clear, this is not meant to be a decision support tool. This is based on just a single model, and there's actually work ongoing to try and build in other models, be able to represent some of that intermodal uncertainty. But I think the hope with this is, a, people understand that there are many different ways to deploy, that different ways to deploy can lead to different impacts, and sort of really sort of have it serve as an entry point to thinking about all of these topics more.
Yeah.
So that's the simulator. The uncertainty database is much more at the moment meant to help structure the research agenda.
Yeah. Who's meant to use the simulator tool? Who's the target audience for that?
Yeah. So, we're thinking like the public, the media, policymakers. We've run multiple workshops now with sort of congressional staffers and policy folks who, maybe they're not literally making decisions themselves about whether or not SAI should be deployed, but they're
Mhm.
part of, the sort of policy apparatus, thinking about, should research be undertaken? And, you know, if so, like, what are the things that we'd want to look into?
Mhm.
And, journalists, for example, who, what we were seeing, and I think just like another problematic element was, most of the research was academic. It was sitting behind paywalls in peer-reviewed journals, and it was written in very academic language, which meant that it was just tough for people to access or to parse. And so if you're a journalist trying to cover this whole topic, um, I think it was very easy to write a story saying this is controversial, full stop.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and trying then to get into kind of any of the substance of what do we know and what do we not know and what would it take to know what we need to know, um, was actually really hard to access. And so we're hoping that this is something that maybe those journalists can pull from as they start to cover it.
Have you heard from anyone using it in that way?
Yeah, we've had a handful of folks who have reached out saying, I use it to mess around and I feel a little bit more equipped to write a story.
That's great.
Yeah.
Cool.
I tell you the coolest moment, and this is a related, but was not really the like first reason behind us building this tool
Uh-huh.
was the digital infrastructure that's required to do this type of research is extensive. Most of the climate modeling that's done, what this is built on top of, requires access to supercomputers, and that has real implications for sort of who gets to participate in this research. And so, we're huge fans of Degrees. We work really closely with the Degrees Initiative, which for um, listeners, Degrees is an organization that supports researchers in the global south to do research on these topics. And one of the things it is incredibly important work on sort of two levels. In part, um, the things that we were just looking at in terms of what would the implications be for precipitation in a given geography.
Hmm.
A researcher in Ghana is going to ask, what does it do to this particular water basin in Ghana in a way that, a researcher in the States might not know to ask. They
Right.
might. And so it's really critical that we have folks around the world asking the questions most germane to them.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we kind of aren't looking at this from every corner. But it's also just, it is important from a capacity building perspective. Like as the world starts to wrestle with these questions, it's really critical that there are scientists, globally who are kind of able to engage in those conversations. Anyway, so Degrees does awesome work. One of the challenges is, access to those supercomputers is limited. Even access to the outputs of those supercomputers can be difficult just because there's such enormous data sets. And so if
Hmm.
you're reliant on consistent Wi-Fi or good upload download speeds, et cetera, it might be hard to work with it and access. And so the one of the things that was really exciting was we brought the simulator to the Degrees Global Forum in Cape Town and had a whole
Which
group
was last year in
that
like
was last
May,
year.
I think. Yeah. Mhm.
And we had a whole group of Degrees funded researchers using the simulator. And we had sort of set them up in different groups to each were sort of playing different teams in different countries, and it was a whole role playing exercise. And the teams were whooping and hollering because they were so. It was so exciting to be able to actually, sort of work with. What are the different ways that we could deploy this rather than with just like a very limited set of
Mm.
scenarios and with the output from it.
That sort of speaks to something that I hear discussed sometimes, which is a lot of the modeling and research is sort of assuming this very idealized happy path scenario of the optimal deployment, and which also assumes that like there is that the politics of like a multilateral coalition is solved for, and that we know when and where we can do this and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the more that we can start to simulate out different potential scenarios, the more that we can better understand not just what we need to make decisions on, but like what we need to understand better, which maybe is a good way to segue into the new product that you guys have put
Yeah.
out, this uncertainties database. So let me pull that up too.
Cool. Yeah, maybe while you're pulling that up, I can give a little bit of sort of how this came about, why we thought it was important.
Mm-hmm.
we built this uncertainty database because we think that the field needs, sort of a shared map. Right now, different research groups are doing really thoughtful work, but they're often either chasing questions in parallel, or, it isn't clear, like, what are the things that sort of most merit time and attention.
Yeah.
And, with limited time and with limited resources until decisions about SAI we think will be taken, we don't think we really have the luxury of meandering through this research. We think it's pretty critical to ensure that resources and energy are focused on the things that matter the most.
Yeah,
And
like sorry, like people are talking about, like, if we are going to do this, sort of the sooner we do it, the better. And if we are going to do this in, say, the second half of the 2030s, then if you have this like long research agenda, you need to be prioritizing funding to specific areas of research, and then there are going to be dependencies on there. You need to learn one thing to lead to the next question, and so on, like that. And so I hear you describing, like, we need a very strategic, like a strategically minded approach to this. This isn't just like science happening in a vacuum. This is a very real world, like, problem solving sort of thing.
Yeah, we wanted to be really methodical about, like, what are the priorities for research, and so with that, we came up with this, on some levels, very simple framework. And then when I say we, this was really Reflective Scientific Advisory Board that, kind of came up with this and started the initial work. And then it is now very much kind of a shared product. So the Scientific Advisory Board took an initial stab. Our team did extensive work to really kind of flesh things out. It was shared publicly. People have provided comments. There's now probably almost too many ways to provide feedback here. And, the goal is very much that this is something that is, kind of community developed, owned, built upon, et cetera. But the framework is pretty simple. So we're trying both to think about how uncertain something might be. So how wrong could we be about this thing? And how much would that matter for decision making? You could imagine that there are some things where we could be, we could be quite wrong about it, in the sense that, like, the confidence intervals are large, but where it doesn't actually make that big of a difference for, the sort of ultimate decisions, whether or not to deploy. And there are other things where, like, we might have a pretty decent sense of the thing, and yet if we're wrong by even a little bit, that could really matter. And so the idea was really to, very, very concretely, and to the extent, in as quantified a way as possible, list out a set of uncertainty, the sort of set of uncertainties for SAI, and then place them in that framework. And so, the top right are things that are high uncertainty and high decision relevance. Bottom left are things that are low uncertainty and low decision relevance. It's important to note that we had to anchor all of this to a single plausible scenario, because particularly for some of the engineering uncertainties, assumptions about timelines are really, really critical. So I don't know if it's easily, I think if you look under about, you should be up at the top. You should be able to pull up this kind of quick diagram. Is it there, or is it under? Yeah, there it is. Here's a quick illustration of the sort of scenario that we have outlined. And, there are significant assumptions in this. We expect to be challenged on that. The intent of it was pick a specific scenario, rather than necessarily saying this is a, scenario Reflective thinks could happen, should happen, et cetera. Sure. But basically what it is saying is that, there would be a period of doing outdoor experiments. Those outdoor experiments would be conducted using existing aircraft, that a very cautious and slow ramp up would start in about 2035, again, using existing aircraft at high latitudes. And then subsequently, there would be a shift over to subtropical high altitude deployment. And that then has implications for expectations around what infrastructure would be required at what times, and hence how uncertain we should consider some
which
of
could refer to, I mean, one of the things that I have gotten this question from people a lot as I've talked about this, of like, oh, could we do this tomorrow if we wanted to? And in some ways, maybe sort of, not really though. And then the longer answer is like, we don't have the planes that would be necessary for this to do it, especially in subtropically, just because you'd have to go so high up, and we don't. That's higher than traditional commercial jets go, and that kind of thing. And it takes time to build and design new planes. Wake Smith is the one who has done a lot of the research on this, and I think he just kind of shorthands it to like, it typically takes 8 to 10 years to make a new plane. So expect that it would take about that amount of time, right?
Yeah, and it takes that long from the moment somebody says it's worth investing billions of dollars into
Right.
novel plane development.
Right.
And I don't think somebody's going to do that until there's clear evidence that it is something that should be done, and there's something that there's kind of financial support to do. And so I think people worry that this could be done tomorrow, and I think that there's actually a lot more sort of breaks in the system than I think people.
Yeah, which is interesting because I would presume that the vast majority of people who know anything about this would be more in the camp of potentially worrying, could this happen tomorrow? But there are also people who are like, why can't we start this tomorrow? And I think it's also useful to maybe go back to this matrix now and talk through, like, why can't we? Well, because there are a lot of things that we don't feel confident about yet, and it's like actually kind of a high risk to take that might not be worth it in the moment.
Yeah. So I think probably the one that I would like draw your attention to is here in the sort of orange center top, aerosol size distribution. This is high decision relevance, medium uncertainty. And this is an uncertainty around what happens to aerosols essentially in the first couple weeks after they might be released from an aircraft. And it is there's a whole set of sort of underlying physical and chemical processes that are kind of bundled up into this. But broadly, the reason that we think this one is particularly important, and why I'm kind of drawing attention here, is that if you use CESM, which is the kind of US predominant climate model, and UKESM, which is UK's model, and in each of them you say we want to produce, we want to cool by a degree or a degree and a half, something like that. They actually agree in large measure on sort of what the downstream effects would be. So you're specifying a global average temperature. They produce similar maps of sort of where in the world is a little bit cooler than that or a little bit warmer than that, the precipitation effects, et cetera. But they differ by a factor of 2 on how much material is required to produce that amount of cooling. And that is because of different assumptions about these aerosol processes and the aerosol sort of resultant aerosol size distribution. And that really matters. I think that matters, on a few levels. If you have to loft 2 times as much material, 2 times as much material is then going to, have 2 times as much deposition, and that could really matter for human health. Right. It could have real implications for ecosystems. It certainly would have significant implications for the physical infrastructure required to get the amount of material up there. At a minimum, it's a linear effect, 2 times as many planes, but I don't actually think that these things scale linearly in terms of the complexity. And I don't think anyone can, nor should they take our assessments of safety and efficacy seriously if we can't, say how much material is required to produce a given amount of cooling.
Right.
Um, so it's interesting because as I said, the models largely agree on these patterns of temperature and precipitation at a given amount of cooling, and so lots of the risks that we worry about, effects on the monsoon, effects on, um, any number of other things. Maybe actually there isn't that much difference there, but uh, it is absolutely vital that we have a much better understanding of these very small scale processes than we do now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fascinating. And so the cool thing about this matrix here is, you can click in and go learn more specifically about these unknown or these things that we have questions about. Um, so with this, I'll ask the same question as I asked about the simulator. Like, who's the intended audience for this, and what do they do with it?
Yeah. So I'd say there's a few different audiences for this. One audience is the research community themselves. Having researchers be able to go in and say, what are the things that I could be spending my time on, that are going to really matter for sort of forthcoming decisions. Another audience is funders. You know, in an ideal world, I think all of this research would be publicly funded, and we'd be moving towards that kind of multilateral governance system that you were mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the moment, that's not the case. There's some government funding, but largely this has been sort of a philanthropically funded space to date. And I think this can be beneficial for funders who are saying, how do I make sure that my funding is going towards real priorities? A thing that we are working on and towards is taking this and sort of taking all of the resulting research activities that relate to each of these uncertainties and putting those essentially on a Gantt chart. So,
Cool.
what is the timeline and the dependencies and, rough order of magnitude costs associated with all of those research activities,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can get to some picture of, basically like, did this activity need to start yesterday? Is it
Yeah.
okay if this thing doesn't start for another couple years? Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, again, there'll be huge assumptions underpinning all of that, but trying to get to the point where, it becomes really easy for funders to put their money towards the things that are most urgent. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I really like that approach. I mean, if you want to do something as big and complicated as this, you do need to approach it from like a project management perspective of putting this out and figuring out how you're going to get the resources there. Um, how much right now do you think that the current research agenda is shaped by access to funding?
I think probably less than people may think from the outside.
Oh, interesting.
I think that I say that in a particular vein. So, I think that there's lots of scrutiny about sort of who is funding in this field, why are they funding, et cetera.
Hmm.
Um, and, it is um, it is largely a philanthropically funded field at the moment. And I think a lot of that is individuals who, on some level are saying some version of like, I have kids or I, really care about, you know, the future of my loved ones. And oh boy, it doesn't feel like we're on track for a planet that, is going to be a good one.
Hmm.
And, you know, I happen to be in a position to put money towards things that feel like they could be important. And so I am, um, uh, I'm always sort of impressed and amazed by just the sort of earnest, um, desire to maybe, contribute to something that could be meaningful that I see, from funders. I think that um, those funders, one of the things that we were trying to do with Reflective is make it easy for funders to put money towards priorities. And I think what we were hearing from a lot of philanthropists was some version of, we're not the experts in this. I may have a
Mhm.
passing interest in it. Mostly I have, the luck to be able to put some money behind, something I believe in. And oh God, I don't know where to start. And and so I think what we've been really trying to do is ensure that the science, can kind of drive what
Yeah.
people fund. And so I haven't seen a lot of it flowing the other way with funders just sort of saying, I have some strong opinion that X or Y needs to be funded. Um, I think that if anything, there's been people sort of sitting on the sidelines because they want to they want to do something meaningful and impactful, and it's just been sort of opaque and hard to tell where that is.
Yeah. What do you think are like the biggest bottlenecks in terms of like how do we move faster in getting through this research
Yeah.
agenda?
I mean, more money certainly helps. The whole field, this is sort of out of date at this point, but up until about a few years ago, I think the best estimates that people had were that $50 million in total had been
Hmm.
invested into the field. There's now been multiple different sort of $50 million commitments. Um, that's great. It is still a fraction of sort of what the national academies and others have said would be required to do the scale of research that's sort of necessary. Um, the next piece is we're in this really sort of difficult and uncomfortable spot where um, many of those, well, some of those uncertainties that were in the uncertainty database, um, the only way that we're going to be able to reduce and resolve them is with empirical data. And that is going
Hmm.
to require doing, carefully controlled, very intentional outdoor experiments. Um, and so we're in this interesting position where, I think the research that's been done to date shows that this is promising, and it shows that there's big open questions. And then attempts to do outdoor experiments to address those open questions largely have stalled. And so we're in this kind of dangerous middle where, those outdoor experiments may show that this is a really bad idea. But the sort of evidence at the moment is largely, sort of, oh, this might be quite promising. And there hasn't really been the sort of political license, social license, governance structures, et cetera, that would facilitate these experiments moving forward. And I think there's both questions of governance, and there are also, you know, we haven't had the sort of specificity about what uncertainty are we trying to answer. What is the
Hmm.
scope or scale of an experiment that would address that priority uncertainty? And then what are the risks associated with that very specific experiment so that there can be a, kind of conscious and, sort of rational discussion about that specific experiment and both
Hmm.
what will be learned and the, almost the risks of not learning those things
Yeah.
and the risks posed by the very specific experiment.
Yeah. It's like I think I hear you saying we're in this weird spot where we're at risk of being overconfident in our models. And so we need to start doing some real world validation of those hypotheses. But there's a lot of opposition to doing that experimentation by the people who I don't want to see it happen. So it's sort of like, well, we need to start doing some controlled experiments so that we can find out. And if this is a bad idea, we should know that sooner than later.
Yeah. And the analogy that we draw is sort of clinical trials in medicine,
Hmm.
um, where medicine poses a sort of similar dilemma, which is like, how do you test an intervention that might save lives, but also could be dangerous? And the answer has been stage gated research, where there's preclinical work before you move into human trials, and then with medicine, there's a phase one, phase two, a phase three,
Hmm.
then regulatory approval, and then even post approval monitoring. And Um, those stage gates, I think, are really critical because one of the concerns that people raise about this is a fear of a slippery slope. That once you start doing anything, and in fact, I think some people would argue even having a conversation like this is, we're down some slippery slope.
Yep.
But the thought is once you start doing an experiment, like you've locked in the idea that you're going to deploy. And I would argue that's just not true. That the reason that something like clinical trials are valuable is that there is evidence that you need to make an informed decision that you can only get by, doing something controlled. And so how do you do that in a way that is responsible and minimizes risk and where there's very clear defined endpoints? And if those endpoints aren't met, you don't proceed. You don't
Right.
slip down the slope. You don't proceed. It stops. And so I think that something very similar could be really valuable here.
Yeah. Yeah. I've thought of the slippery slope argument as like pretty cynical, and not having a lot of faith in institutions and collective decision making capabilities and stuff. And perhaps that's true. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for why one would sort of think that in today's world. But I also have just come around to, well, we have to figure out how to overcome that anyway, because climate change is just that bad.
Yeah.
So
I mean, on some levels, I get it. Like, we are in a difficult, weird time, and being cynical about, I've spent most of my career sort of near multilateral institutions, and it is sort of devastating to see, sort of support for multilateralism, be as low as it is right now. And so, I think it is real that we're in a different geopolitical time, and that we need to be forthright about that. It is not good to be sort of naive about sort of the complexity involved in all of this. But I think that as you say, like, climate is really bad, and it is only getting
yeah.
worse. And I think the thing that would be the worst of all is we don't do the research. We can't, we can't, or we don't want to figure out how to do careful, sort of responsible research. And so we sort of sit in the level of knowledge that we have today. And then be it 5, 10, 15 years from now, things get more, they get more dire.
Yeah.
And suddenly people are making decisions, and they're making it on the basis of that evidence rather than, what we could have known by that point. And so I really want to see really rigorous research done so that when those decisions are made, we know as much as we possibly can.
Well said. I think that's probably a good spot to wrap up here. Final question is, what are you most excited about? What's coming for what you're working on at Reflective?
So the digital infrastructure that that researchers use to do this research, it's slow, it's inaccessible, and if we want to think about how you accelerate the research, changing the tools that people are using to do the research is a really powerful, sort of lever. And so we have been thinking about a handful of things that would just simply make it easier and faster and more inclusive for researchers to be involved. And so, one of those is a cloud hub that we've stood up. And so it's cloud storage and cloud compute, and researchers can, they can log in. We preload it with data, sort of some of the outputs of these big Earth systems runs or system model runs, so that they can do analysis really easily. It obviates some of those things that we were talking about earlier in terms of the risk of losing stuff in terms of upload and download. And people can share their code, they can share their workflows. And so, whether you're somebody who's kind of infrastructure limited or you're just new to the field, it makes it a lot easier to do your work. And then the kind of big Swing for the fences, I don't know, project that we're working on is, one of the challenges in modeling anything SAI related is that we care about things from the very, very, very small, these sort of tiny spatial and temporal scales all the way up to the whole atmosphere over the next 100 years. And, as you can imagine, you need different models to look at those different scales. And when we're using physics-based numerical models, there are already some of the most computationally intensive models in the world. If you then try and kind of stitch together, these really, really small scale microphysics models along with, big Earth systems models, it just doesn't, at some point, it doesn't really work.
Makes sense.
And so our team is working on building ML emulators at various scales and then coupling those so that we would have a way to kind of understand, okay, if we are wrong about this thing at the very small scale, how does that change the impacts writ large over the next 100 years? So you can couple it, you can explore the uncertainty space, and ultimately, if outdoor experiments do move forward, you'd be able to kind of take that empirical data, use it to kind of refine the models, and ultimately to be able to get sort of better forecasts of what we think the impacts might be.
That's very cool. That sort of reminds me of like trying to reconcile macroeconomics and microeconomics. Like they're very different, but in the end, they're related.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the goal here is, emulators. We think there are sort of 4 relevant scales, and each of those emulators can run faster. The hope, we're building them, so we don't know, but the hope is that they run faster, with sort of high fidelity, and then we can couple them to really explore how the micro things relate to the macro things in a way that is sort of provides a feedback loop for the science.
Cool. Well, you guys are working on really, really interesting things, and you're serving a role that no one else in this field is doing, and you're doing it very well. So I really respect a lot of the work that you guys have put out there. It's been really cool to see.
Thank you. It's been fun to chat and fun to partner in general.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for doing this first episode with me. I'm excited about it, and we'll get it out there. And yeah,
super
thanks.
Fun. Thank
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. We just finished wrapping up that episode with Dakota and talking about the work at Reflective. And that's my first episode. I'm looking for feedback on, is this the kind of thing that those of you who are already subscribed find interesting? Like, I'm wondering, do you want to know more about how the sausage gets made? Do you want to see more discussion about some of these maybe more political questions around climate interventions? Do you want to see more like spicy takes? Like, any ideas that you have, I would love to hear them. So please leave a comment. And I hope that you subscribe to this podcast. And I've definitely got some more interesting episodes planned, and I hope to get those out to you pretty soon.